Hi, welcome to Quiet Connection, a podcast dedicated to ending the stigma around postpartum mental health. I'm Chelsea. Today I'm connecting with Courtney, known to her Instagram followers as Knock on Motherhood. She shares her challenging path through fertility struggles, miscarriages, preeclampsia, and a traumatic birth, all the while highlighting her dedication to raising awareness and supporting others facing similar ordeals. Let's hear from Courtney. Hello. Today I'm here with Courtney. Courtney, how are you?
Good. I'm glad to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us. Courtney, our listeners may know you from your Instagram account, Knock on Motherhood. If you follow Quiet Connection follows Courtney, so it's easy to find. But I think I'll start out how I start all my episodes, and I'll ask you to tell me a little bit about yourself and who you were before you became a mom.
Sure. I'm Courtney. I run an Instagram account and blog, Knock on Motherhood, that I started, like 3 years ago. It was right before COVID all happened, so kind of goes with all that. I'm a mom to two now. I have a 4.5-year-old and a 2-month-old. And that's kind of what I do, and I do stuff within the preeclampsia community and NICU and preemie community, so that's kind of where I focus on. And then before mom, I actually got pregnant with my oldest when I was just about to graduate college. So I was in my first trimester when I graduated, and I graduated with a healthcare administration degree. So right after I graduated, I just kind of got a job. So I worked at a bank, but I previously had worked at just at a local health clinic. I was doing healthcare billing. So it's kind of a broad spectrum. And then now I do preeclampsia stuff. So
yeah. Were kids something that were always sort of in your future? Was it something that you always wanted to do, or you always wanted to be a mom, or not so much?
I mean, kind of. I'm not really much of an other person's kids person.
Yeah.
Like, I don't really deal like other people's kids too much. Like, I see that, like, obviously my nieces and nephews or like my friends' kids, I do like because I know them. But I was never the type to be like, oh my gosh, that's a baby, I need to hold it, even if I don't really know them. I'm not a huge kid person. Like, they're sticky, they're loud.
Yes.
But I mean, I guess always eventually I thought I would be one, like way in the future. So a couple years after my husband and I were married, he brought up the idea of like, oh, we should start having kids. And I was like, wait, what? Like, that's like years in advance. So eventually we got into that same page and we started trying and had losses. And yeah, which we'll go more into the episode of how fun the journey that's been. But so I always thought maybe eventually, but happened a lot sooner than I thought, but I'm glad it did because I absolutely love it. Being a mom's the best.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, it seems like there's such a broad spectrum too, but the extremes are pretty evident. A lot of the people that I talk to are either like, oh yes, I always wanted to be a mom, or I mean, maybe. So I kind of thought maybe someday, but yeah, I'm glad that your journey, which we will get into, brought you your 2 children and that you're loving being their mom. That leads us very seamlessly into your journey to motherhood. What did that look like? So when your partner decided, yeah, I think it's time we start having kids, and you're like, okay, what? What did that journey look like for you?
Yeah, so we went and saw my doctor. I had an IUD at the time, so I got it out. We're just kind of like, well, if it happens, it happens. Like, you're finishing up your last year of school. I was only a little bit ahead of him. And so we're like, well, if it happens, it happens. Kind of like not preventing, but not really trying too much. And about, I think it was 2 or 3 months after we started. It feels so long ago, even though it's only like 6. So I can't even remember. I guess that's also sleep deprivation too, where I can't remember exact day. But it was like 2 or 3 months into it, we had our first loss, which was a chemical pregnancy, and we were living in Alabama at the time for my husband's internship, and it was kind of traumatic because I had gotten a positive test and I was like, oh wow, like this is happening. And then about a week and a half ish later, I started bleeding really severely. And it really scared me because I was like, what? I never really had that. My mom was very lucky and had 4 pregnancies and 4 kids. She never had a loss or miscarriage or anything. And I knew they happened to people, but didn't really know what like that entailed. Like I've heard of people losing babies. I knew people who lost babies, but never really like miscarriage. So I ended up calling my parents, be like, "Oh, surprise! We found out we were pregnant, but like now I'm really bleeding." So kind of like, "Well, you should go see someone. What if something's really wrong? Like you're bleeding." So we end up going. It was on a Sunday in the deep south, so the only thing open is the
Mm.
ER. So we go to
Ugh.
the ER, and basically they're like, "You took the test wrong." Like that's like the short story of it is. There's no way you took the test wrong. You're not pregnant. Da 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 da. And so that kind of really was like, oh well, maybe I wasn't. Maybe I made it up. I read it wrong. It's like, but no, I bought the test that day. Like it's not an expired test. I bought it at the store like that day. So that kind of made me doubt, like, oh, I never really had anything. Um, about a month or two later, we got pregnant again, ended up being a chemical, but this time we were back in our home in Idaho. And I was like, okay, well, it happened again. And then it happened a third time.
Mm.
And the fourth time I got it positive, I waited several weeks before I even tested. Found out I was pregnant, and that one stuck, and that ended up being my oldest daughter. So that's kind of how the beginning part began.
That must have been so challenging for you to even be able to enjoy when you did finally get and stay pregnant because you had gone through so many losses or just confusing circumstances.
Yeah, it was tough, but I feel like I suppressed so much of it at the time. So really all didn't come out until all the trauma happened with my daughter and everything kind of came, flooding in at once. Like
Okay.
I was sad and really upset, but I was 21 when I got pregnant with my daughter. So I was about 20 going into 21. So I was still kind of younger. And again, I didn't really realize what miscarriages really were. I feel like I just kind of put in the back burner,
Mm.
especially after my first experience of like, oh, you didn't you didn't take a urine
Yeah.
test right and stuff. Um, so I did, and I had a great doctor. I really enjoyed him. It was one of those practices where you see a bunch of different doctors
Mhm.
because whoever, is on call when you deliver, that's who delivers. Um, so I mean, it was fine at the time, and I just kind of tugged along. I was extremely nauseous, but I never puked. And I was nauseous up until about 16, 17 weeks.
Mm.
And then we did find out that she was a girl at a 16-week ultrasound because we did one of those gender ultrasounds.
Yeah.
And that was really exciting because I've always wanted a girl. I always have. I'm a girly girl, so I wanted a girl really bad. And so did my husband. So we were pretty excited that she was a girl and our first was going to be a girl. And my pregnancy was pretty nothing out of the ordinary for a good while, just like anybody else. And around 31, 32 weeks, I started getting high blood pressure at my doctor's office. And so they prescribed me a blood pressure cuff and told me, oh, start keeping track of it at home. If it gets anything over 140 over 90, you call us if we're open and you come in if you're open, but if not, you go to L&D. I
Mm.
was like, okay, whatever. Like, this is just annoying. Like, no one really explained to me, like, why it was important. Like, I knew high blood pressure wasn't, like, good, but, no one really explained to me. So I was like, whatever. I just started keeping track. And then I end up hitting that number. So I call my husband, he's at work. I'm like, I hit that number. I'm not going into work today. I told my boss I'm not coming in. I'm gonna go straight to the office. And he was kind of like freaking out. He's like, well, I can't get off yet, but I'll meet you there. We only had one car at the time, so I took mine and I drove over to my doctor's office. I waited there forever because it was a very busy office.
Mm.
As so the town I went to college is very well known for young parents and young
Mm.
families. So everyone's like pregnant there. So it was a very busy office, and so I just kind of waited around because I didn't have an appointment. And eventually, I was seen. I was seen by what I know now. was the MFM, but at the time I didn't. It's just a doctor I hadn't ended up seeing yet. And so he took my blood pressure a couple times. My husband eventually comes over because he had to run across town to meet me. And so it's like, oh, calm down, think of your favorite place, things like that. And I just kind of kept hitting that number over and over again. So he's like, well, we think you have gestational hypertension. It was a Friday. So this weekend, come back and see me on Monday, and we'll schedule you, for a couple appointments, and we'll just kind of take it how it goes. So like, oh, okay, whatever. So we go to the following appointments, and they schedule me ultrasounds and all this kind of stuff. And then eventually I go into an appointment, and they tell me I have to go straight to L&D because they need to take 24-hour urine test. My blood pressure is really high, all that kind of stuff. So I just got sent straight to the hospital, which where my doctor's office was, the hospital was just right around the corner. But my blood pressure must have been high enough, and I was bad enough that they told me I couldn't drive. I had to wait for my husband to get there to take me.
Oh no.
So I call him. Oh, by the way, they sent me to the hospital. You got to get here. So I'm calling my friends. I'm calling anybody like, hey, can you pick him up, take him here? But instead, he just goes running across town to meet me. So I'm just sitting there twiddling my thumbs, waiting for him to come. So he drives me over. We get in. They get you all ready for everything. They have me put on a gown. They put me up to the monitors, all that kind of stuff. And it's like, okay, whatever. This is just something I have to get through. And my blood pressure is just, it's hidden. The thing is like, I didn't feel sick. I really didn't. I felt fine. I mean, I was swollen, but everyone's swollen when you're pregnant. And so it's like, everyone's just kind of overreacting. Like, I felt fine. So they have to collect my urines. So true love is pouring your spouse's urine from the toilet into a bigger jar. Because that's what my husband ended up doing, because we're on the L&D floor. So if a baby's being born, all the nurses are a little occupied.
Yeah.
So if that little toilet hat got too full, that became my husband's job. Like, that's true love. I knew my husband loved me before. I really did. But after everything like that, I was like, you're really true love.
You heard it here first. You heard it. That's true love, everybody.
Yes. So you did all that. 24 hours later, I'm like, okay, I finally can get to go home. I get to go home. I was kind of suppressing everything. Like, I can cry about this when I get home. I'm only here 24 hours. I'll, deal with this when I get home. They come in, a nurse comes in to like reposition monitors because they have to do that every so often because baby moves. And it's like, oh, when will I be able to, get home and stuff like that? And she goes, oh, well, my doctor, wants you to stay in longer. And then I lost it. Like, I started crying hysterically. And
yeah.
So I was like, what the heck is all this happening to me? And I felt so embarrassed, but I was crying hysterically because I really didn't understand everything that was happening, really. There wasn't good communication from my doctor and from the people there and things like that. And so that stay ended up turning into a 3-day stay because my blood pressure just kept spiking up. So they're doing all these different combinations of blood pressure medication to try and keep it stable because I turned 32, 33 weeks during my stay. So I was still pretty early, but they wanted to keep me in as long as possible. So when they released me on strict bed rest. So I just hung out home and twiddled my thumbs and made it my life. So at that point, I was very miserable. Like, this sucks. Like, and I had to go into my doctor's office unexpectedly all the time because my blood pressure reached whatever new number they had given me to come in. And it got to the point where they had maxed me out on pills, but I was still hitting like 180, 190s, like real easily. And I was really swollen and everything like that. But I never complained of a headache. I never really had one. Looking back, I did have some like stomach pain, but I really thought that was pregnancy at that point because I was also just so miserable. I was just sitting on a bed all day.
Yeah.
Like, you kind of have aching pains when you do that. So I go to the doctor after that, barely made it through my baby shower and everything. And we go in for just what I think it's a normal appointment. Go, well, we're going straight to the hospital. You're having a baby today. Like,
oh
you're
my gosh.
It's like, what? I was 35 weeks and 3 days at that point. So all this stuff happened within like a week, 2 weeks.
Yeah.
So it was intense, and especially at 22 years old when all I've known is normal pregnancies, normal births. No one around me ever had a preemie that I knew. I didn't know anybody who had NICU or anything like that, or even preeclampsia. I never knew what that word was
Mhm.
until they told me that's what I had. I had never even heard of it before.
When did they actually explain to you that you had preeclampsia? Because it sounds like up until this point they weren't very communicative with you.
It was when I got released the first time at bed rest. They told me, "Oh, you have preeclampsia."
Okay.
So that's the first time I heard of it. I totally skipped over that part, but they did tell me what I had when I was released the first time.
Okay.
So I knew that's what I had. So I had spent some Googling,
Of course.
everything. But I still didn't really understand really what it was or what it meant. Like, okay, obviously I'm not the only person in the world that's had this happen because there's a name for it.
Yeah.
But yeah, not really anything else besides that.
And so then all of a sudden it's baby day.
Yes, so it's baby day. So before we left my doctor's office to get to the hospital, I was having my normal NST the day before that they had me scheduled, and they're picking up contractions, like steady
Mm.
contractions. I was like, I don't feel anything. Like, she's just moving around. She was a very, very active baby. Like, I could feel her do everything, even from super early. Most don't feel them around
Yeah.
14, 15 weeks. So I'm like, I'm convinced that's a baby. I've never felt anything like that before. So I felt her very early. She's very active, constantly moving. So like she just feels like she's moving. Feels like she's kicking her feet and pushing her hands up against me. But I guess it was contractions, so I guess I have a really high pain tolerance.
Yeah.
And so I was having steady contractions. He's like, before you go, I want to check because you have these contractions. So I was like, yeah, sure, whatever. So I ended up being dilated at 3 to a 4 in 35 weeks. So it was already like
Wow.
progressing along. So when I got to the hospital, because I was already dilated that much on my own, they just broke my water to try and progress everything further. So I kind of labored there for a while. They hooked me up to magnesium sulfate, which makes you feel like complete crap.
Awful. Yeah.
You've been on it.
I have
Yes.
not been on it, but one of my best friends has, and I was listening along for the experience and she was not happy.
Oh, it's absolutely horrible. I describe it as like the worst flu you've ever had on steroids. Like,
Yeah.
you're so hot, you're so sleepy, you're so completely just out of it. Like, you're in a totally different world. Like, you're just high on drugs. Like, you're
Yeah.
just so out of it. So I took the magnesium, all this stuff. I hadn't taken the group B strep because I hadn't made it that far along.
Right.
So they gave me antibiotics just in case, all this different kind of stuff. And I was just kind of hanging out like, oh, okay, this thing's happening. Like, not really, I mean, taking it seriously, but not at the same time. Because I'm just like, okay, whatever. Like, my poor husband who's stressed to the max. I was always like, oh, is that a contraction? Like, can you look and see if that's what it was? He's so stressed. And so he's calling my mom, like, oh, by the way, mom, I'm having a baby today. What? She lives in another state. So it was just us two,
Yeah.
basically. We had friends that lived close, and they were so nice. The first time we had a hospital stay, they went to our apartment and brought us like toothpaste and toothbrushes, things like that, because we didn't have anything packed.
Yeah.
We had learned at this time to always have a packed suitcase in the car. So we had stuff this time. So we always kept it with us because we never knew. And just hanging around. A couple hours later pass, and my daughter starts having D cells. My blood pressure is just skyrocketing. They can't control it. So they end up deciding to do a C-section. So I was rolled away to an emergency C-section. And it was extremely dramatic for me because all of a sudden I'm being rolled over. All of a sudden I'm having surgery. Like, what the heck? I feel so awful. Um, and I found out I really wasn't fully numb. And I only know that because I've
Mm.
had a repeat C-section, and I was shocked at how little I felt. So
Wow. Oh
I
my
thought that was
gosh.
normal. So I did feel a lot. I wasn't completely numb. Like, I could still feel like I can move my toes and stuff like
Okay.
that. Versus my repeat C-section, I was completely I couldn't do any of that stuff. So which explains why I felt like it was so horrible too.
Yeah.
But the reason why is because, we probably didn't have time.
Mm.
Still not the best, right? But I had an epidural previously because they already had given it to me. So they just put in a spinal. as I was going into the OR. So,
Okay.
my daughter's born. I hear her cry, but I don't see her. They don't lift her above or anything like that. They took her. So the OR had a window into the NICU directly
Mhm.
into it. So they just put her directly in the NICU. But I couldn't see anything. I'm completely strapped down and everything like that. And that was extremely traumatic for me. I never saw her. I didn't see her until she had been alive for 27 hours the
Oh my
next day.
gosh.
Because after my surgery, they wheeled me into everything. I was still hooked to magnesium. The next morning, still hooked to magnesium. When you're hooked to magnesium, you have to stay in your bed. You're stuck in
Yeah.
your bed. So,
So
yeah,
she
it was
she went to the
horrible.
NICU.
Hmm.
Did dad go with her?
Yes, yep. He was able to go straight in, which I'm really grateful for. He has tons of pictures, tons of videos of her first, moments of life. She was exactly 4 pounds and she was
Wow.
17 inches long. So she was really tiny, which is still pretty tiny for a 35-weeker. She was growth restricted.
Mm.
So she had that kind of going for her. And he was able to spend time with her in the NICU. He did tons of skin to skin. Um, I was hospitalized for 6 days. I was able to go home day 6 just because of my blood pressure. Even when I got off magnesium, my blood pressure was still doing kind of crazy things. So they were experimenting with different levels of medication. And when I was good enough and when I was okay, I went over to the NICU, but I was hardly really around her first 6 days of life.
Yeah.
She really struggled to eat being premature, so she had an NG tube. That's how she ate. I really wanted to breastfeed, but I never could, and my milk really didn't come in. It didn't come in until much later. And then when it did, it was hardly anything.
Mhm.
And so I tried my hardest too. And so when I would do pump, they would fortify her milk with a high calorie formula. And then after that, when I couldn't pump anymore, she just had straight up high calorie formula. On day 14, she was able to get her NG tube out because she took all her feedings by mouth, and then we took her home day 15. So basically, as soon as she figured it out, we were home because that was really her only issue was eating and
Was
being able to
eating.
grow. She never had to be on oxygen or anything else. It was just wanting to eat.
So she was in the NICU for 15 days
Hmm.
total. And it's ironic that we're recording today. Today is World Prematurity Day.
Yes.
Yes. So what was that like for you, especially if dad was with her so much of the time in the NICU, especially for that first 24, 27 hours? Like, were you pretty much on your own after the surgery?
Yeah, basically, my memories is so fuzzy. I correlate all 6 days with just like one day.
Yeah.
Like I remember bits and pieces, but I couldn't tell you like this happened on this day, this happened on this day. It wasn't until I wrote down my whole birth story on my blog because my husband was with me. Oh, this happened this day, and all this kind of stuff, and my medical
Yeah.
records right there. So it's all kind of a blur. My mom came up day 2 or 3. I was already off magnesium when she was able to come up because she lived in a completely different state.
Mhm.
Um, and that was really great because I was like, I just want my mom. I want my, I
Yeah,
want
of
my mom.
course.
And it was really hard. Looking back, especially now having a quote normal unquote C-section and recovery, it's like I can't believe I was able to do that. Like, I mean, when you want to see your own baby, you can
Yeah.
do crazy things, but yeah, it was tough. It really made the recovery really hard. I feel like I never really fully recovered for several years afterwards, just because I was doing so much so soon. I never gave my body the time to recover, not only from the physical trauma, like the emotional, mental trauma too.
Yeah, absolutely. I had a C-section with my second, and I can't imagine a climbing upstairs in general and doing that every day, but of course, like you said, you'll do whatever you have to do to get to see your baby.
Hmm.
Did you find it at all difficult to sort of start that bonding process since you had that separation from her?
Yeah, yeah. And she reminded me of like all the trauma I had been through too. Like I
Mm,
went through this because of her. I blamed all my anger kind of on her. and especially in the beginning, because I didn't really know who this baby was, and all these bad things happened because I had a baby.
Yeah.
And then all that anger kind of transferred over to my husband for a while. He's the one that got me pregnant. Like, this is all his fault. Then it kind of transferred over to, like, oh, my body, it's my body's fault. And transferred over to God. Oh, it's God's fault. Like, it was transferring over to all these different people and things at different moments of the healing, process. And I feel like I couldn't say I was fully bonded with her until about a year. So
Mm.
at that point, like, she was off formula, which was a big, big thing of mine because I really wanted to breastfeed. I knew the benefits of it. I knew the benefits of breast milk, and that's just what I really wanted to do.
Yeah.
And so it completely crushed me when it was taken away from me. Like, even after she came home, and I probably could have tried, I really couldn't have because my body was sick still. I was still really high on with my blood pressure. I was able to get off meds at 8 weeks postpartum, but at that point, it's kind of hard to build up any supply if you never really had one to begin with.
Yeah,
And so that
absolutely.
really crushed me, was feeding her, and I got a lot of flack, like really just not nice
Mm.
comments about things of how she was born, how I was feeding her, all these kind of stuff from people who don't really matter.
Right.
But I was so crushed already with it and saying those things to myself that hearing someone else say something of the sort just confirmed, like, I was a failure. This is the worst thing that ever happened, things like that. So about a year is when I could say I was fully bonded. Like, I had kind of healed mostly physically. I was in therapy, so I was starting to heal mentally and emotionally and things like that. And that's kind of when babies become fun, in my
Yeah.
opinion, because
Yeah.
they're really a lot more interactive. They're not just eat, sleep, poop. Like, they kind of play more. They recognize you. They start to babble. And that was really fun for me to see all the firsts and stuff like that. Because, like I said, I'm not a huge baby person. They're just kind of boring.
Yeah, I feel that. I do. So something that you said sort of resonated with me and made me think too. It's not abnormal, especially if you go through a birth trauma like that, to have trouble bonding. I also hate that question a little bit, even though I ask it, like, oh, how did you bond? Um, because it's not as natural as people like to make you think it is. For some people it does come very naturally, but for a
hmm
lot of us it's work. It's actual work to like form a connection with this tiny human that just lives in your house with you and is kind of sucking the life out of you all the time. So
hmm
so obviously you do what you need to do. You love your baby and you take care of your baby, but learning to like them and learning to get to know them, that's a process.
I feel like, especially with the first baby you like bring home too, it's such a huge life change.
Yeah.
Like, all of a sudden you're not working anymore. You can't just do things whenever you want to do things. And if you need to go somewhere, I need the car seat, I need food, I need all these, things like that. Versus subsequent kids, you're already in that mode. So you kind of already know what to expect and you're used to that lifestyle. At least that's my opinion, being only two
Oh
months
yeah.
into it.
I
But
know.
it's a lot different. It's not as drastic of a change.
I was gonna say also props to you for agreeing to do this at 2 months postpartum. If mine was still 2 months old, I'd be like, I'll get back to you in a year. Like,
Oh my gosh, I feel bad when people say stuff like that sometimes because my first, it was so traumatic and so awful. So I feel so great and
but
so good.
that's
So I'm like,
great. That's good. I mean, and we'll totally get into it because I'll have questions about that too. Um, because there is this whole like every birth experience and pregnancy experience is so different. Um, and just because you have some experiences in your first pregnancy does not mean that's going to dictate what subsequent pregnancies are going to look like. But I'm always so happy to hear that after someone has gone through the types of trauma that you went through, you were able to have a birth experience. Hopefully, we'll get into it because I don't know the whole story of your second birth experience, but that that was more what you expected.
it really is. Like, I will only say this to like certain people who like bring it up first because like it really is. Especially if you think compared to what I had before, this is really easy.
Yeah.
Like, it's still hard, right? It has its hard moments and it's birth, it's hard. But I'm consciously always comparing it to my first experience, which is the only experience I've ever had, and it's like night and day difference. So it does feel like it's so easy.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and that's great. I'm so glad. It and again, if that's not the case for some people, that's okay too. Every single experience is different, but it does always sort of warm my heart a little bit because it I don't want to say that it can be healing. Maybe you would say it's healing, but I don't want to put those words in your mouth, but it I guess I'll just ask it. Do you feel like it sort of healed a little bit of that trauma?
Absolutely. I mean, like, I felt healed before, right? Like, I wasn't crying about it every single day. I mean, I talked about it every single day because that's just what I do for work, and this is what I do in
Yeah.
my free time. So, like, I do talk about it, but I'm never triggered by it really. There are a few times, particularly during my second pregnancy, I was triggered where it really like broke me down and tore me down, but I don't get triggered really all that often anymore. And I can talk about it more of just saying it as facts versus
Yeah.
getting really emotional about it. So I did feel pretty healed, but having a subsequent birth that ended up being so wonderful and such a great experience is like, wow, this is really what I was missing. And I really thought maybe it would make things a lot sadder with my first. So like, wow, this is how many stuff I missed out with my first. Like, I never got this. This is so wonderful. But I don't know. Like, maybe it's because there's enough years and enough healing between that I really don't feel that sadness. And maybe I will months from now when it's
Yeah.
not as like fresh and high on everything of how wonderful things
On all the
are.
love
But
hormones.
yeah, but I really do feel like it healed a lot of me, particularly with my ectopic pregnancy. It
Yeah.
healed a lot.
So sort of we jumped around a little bit, but
Hmm.
it's so hard for me to say like how do you distinguish that from PTSD because of what you went through? And maybe it was a mixture of all of that. um what what was that sort of like for you, and did you have, you mentioned your mom lived in a different state, what kind of support network did you have for you and your partner when you were going through that?
I really felt like I didn't have any. Like I did have some friends that would check on me, but I was the first of a lot of my friends to have a baby. I had one friend who already had a baby, but hers was quote normal unquote.
Mm, mm,
So like she just couldn't relate. Like she could relate to the fact that she was a mom, so she could understand like, wow, if I was separated from my baby, like that would be really hard. But we just went through two totally different birthing experiences. It was kind of hard to like connect in that way. And they had moved shortly a few months after I had the baby because her husband graduated and they went and did the rest of their lives. So I really felt very alone. Like I knew there were people that were kind of there for me, but I was so in my head and so depressed and no one really understood. It's like I mentioned before, I was the only one I knew in my life who had a preemie. I was the only one I knew in my life who had a NICU. My
yeah.
mom all had quote normal births and experiences. She did have C-sections, but they were always planned. They were never like an emergent thing. And so I was like, I'm the only one in the world who's ever experienced anything like this. And so that really made me depressed. And I just hated life. I hated the way things were going. I thought nothing will ever get better. And it was just absolutely horrible. So I felt like I had little to no support. Like I'm sure there were people around me who felt like they were supporting me, but I feel like when you're so depressed and so deep into yourself, like nobody's there, if that makes sense. Like you
Mm-hmm.
feel like nobody's there. And so that was really difficult. My husband was in his last semester of college, and so we were just in a tiny apartment. I was by myself with a tiny baby, and life just sucked. It just
Yeah.
absolutely sucked.
What got you through those moments? Where did you sort of recognize within yourself that something was up? Did you reach out to
It
your
was
doctor?
no. So my doctor, I will always credit him. Like he saved mine and my daughter's life. Like I always will. But he was not that great.
Mm,
He didn't really have really good bedside manner or things
mm.
like that. Although he did see me every single week after I gave birth for blood pressure checks and weaned me off and things like that. But I don't know. I just felt like nobody really asked me. They never really. It wasn't until I asked for like, is it normal to still feel baby blues when I was getting my IUD back in at 8 weeks? Is it still normal to feel baby blues? I was
Yeah.
like, I don't know.
Oh,
And so I
man.
got handed that paper they have you fill out, of
Yep.
always or sometimes, and that kind of was the end of it. My husband noticed a change in me, and I was like, I probably should go to therapy. Like, I probably should. Like, I was aware enough of therapy, and I feel like how society is right now, it's very like you can just go to therapy. Like, it's not as taboo as it used to be.
Mm-hmm.
And so I found a therapist that was on the insurance plan, and I walked over to where the office was, and I went for 8-ish, 10-ish weeks, somewhere around there. And she was fine. I think at the time I just needed somebody to just listen to my whole
Mm-hmm.
story. And that's kind of how she practiced, it's just listening. It's nothing any really like of coping skills or anything
Mm.
like that. That's just the way that she practiced, which at the time was good enough because that's kind of what I needed. I just needed somebody who would listen and acknowledge how horrible and hard it was, because a lot of people were telling me, wow, what a miracle it is. What a miracle your daughter is. What a miracle you survived. All this kind of stuff. I'm like, it's not, but it's not.
Yeah.
And so I just needed somebody who would do that. And so that was really helpful. And I stopped seeing her when we moved to a different city, and I felt pretty okay. Several months later, my husband had some things happen in his personal life that really like broke him down. And then he started seeing a therapist. And then we eventually started going together to see her.
Mm.
So we had basically couples therapies, I guess you could categorize it as, but we always talked about like that experience and coping with it and all the different things. And that was really helpful. That really changed us because we were both struggling. We were two traumatized people dealing with it in two different ways. And so it's really hard. It's really hard.
Yeah. That leads kind of perfectly into one of my next questions is how did that whole experience affect your relationship with your partner, and not only your partner but like family and friends? Like you said, you didn't have a lot of friends to relate to. Um but I guess, yeah, most specifically, how did that experience affect your relationship with you and your partner?
It affected it a lot. Like it definitely made us stronger looking back, but it was more of like, I don't know how to deal with this. Like,
Mm.
we are just two traumatized people in two different ways. We never wanted to like break up or divorce or anything like that, but we just weren't happy. And it wasn't necessarily happy with not happy with each other or being with each other. It was just in general,
Yeah.
unhappy. And so that was really hard. Especially with going right into COVID. My husband graduated right when COVID was happening. So then it was
Oof.
hard to find jobs, and stuff like that. So
Yeah.
like it almost seemed like anything that could go wrong really did go wrong. And it went wrong really bad. And so it was really hard. Life was hard. But he was the only one who understood what I went through because he was
Hmm.
there every single step of the way, and I was there every single step of the way too. So we're the only two people that really understood what was happening. And as far as family and friends, it really made me think of there were a lot of people that I thought I had good relationships with, but when it came down to it, I really didn't. They weren't there when we
Mm.
needed them the most. And that particularly really hurt my husband a lot for a lot of his relationships too. And so that really made us evaluate of what kind of relationships we wanted to have and who we wanted to have it with too.
Yeah.
And we don't have as many relationships with people as we used to have because of how we were treated when we were going through the worst part of our lives. And I think when something like that happens to you, it really changes your life view on everything.
Hmm.
Like we saw our daughter fighting for life every single day. We saw that, and so we're like, well, we don't want to spend our time with people who make us feel like XYZ and stuff like that.
Right. Of course. And it reminds me of something that I read recently. It's like when you go through these big traumatic moments and you realize who your people are, and the people that you lose in that process, they it doesn't mean that they're erased from your life completely. They're just not main characters in your story anymore. Um which helped me a little bit. It helped me feel a little less angry about it, but yeah, you really do realize who your network is and who your village is, because that's what you need when you're going through that. You need a community and you
Absolutely.
need a village, and to hear that you didn't have that, um that hurts my heart, and I'm so sorry. When did you and your partner decide that you were wanting to and ready to try again and add another family member?
Yeah, that's a heavy question. It's really long. So about 2-ish years after my daughter was born. So in my head, once I decided I wanted kids, in my head I'm like, oh, 2 years apart. That like that's perfect. You go bam, 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 bam. Get them all done. And so around the 2-year mark, I was like, well, I don't have another kid already, and I'm not pregnant, and things like that. And so it's like, well, maybe I do want another. Like, it would be great. And I really wanted her to have siblings. I love the relationship I have with some of my siblings, and I wanted her to have that. And I never imagined my family as just being one and done.
Hmm.
One and done is great and it's wonderful and it's great for some people. And I was really content being one and done. Like I loved life and everything like that, but it's just not what I ever imagined it being. So I was really kind of struggling with that. And around that time, I ended up getting a blood clot in my leg. So I had to go on medication
Mm.
for that. So that kind of delayed it even more because I couldn't get pregnant. So it caused birth defects. So once that was all kind of settled, it was around year 3 or like, okay, I think we do. I think we're ready. I was the one to really push it. I really want another. I really want another. My husband was absolutely terrified. He's like, no, I'm gonna lose you. I'm gonna lose you this time.
Oh my
Like,
gosh. Yeah. Yeah.
and it's like, no, we're okay. So I went to preconception visits with the doctor that came recommended, and he was fine. I liked him fine. Kind of gave me a baseline knowledge of what another pregnancy would look like and how they would treat me if I were to get preeclampsia again. But I kind of really didn't like him that much. So I kind of waited a little longer, and then I saw another doctor that came recommended from a friend, and he was absolutely wonderful. I really enjoyed the office. I really enjoyed them, and I felt like if something bad were to happen, I would be taken care of and it would be okay.
Oh, good.
And so at that point is when I got my ID out and we really started to try. So I'm like, it's been almost 4 years. I don't want to wait around forever. Like, let's just
Yeah.
get this thing going. We've been talking about it for years. And so I was meticulously tracking, and it took, I think it was about 6 months before we got pregnant. And I was really excited and I was ecstatic. And it came at a really odd time because I was tracking my ovulation and I noticed my LH wasn't going down. Like, that's really weird. It, usually peaks and goes down. So I decided to stick in a pregnancy test and it ended up being like a blaring positive. So like, oh, well, that's weird. Maybe I just had weird cycles or whatever. Woo, I'm pregnant.
Yeah.
And we were so excited. And about a week or so later, I started to really severely bleed. Like, had really severe cramps. I was bleeding a lot, like really large clots. It's
Mm.
like, oh my gosh, this is it. But I'm further along, so this is it. This is really bad, miscarriage and stuff. So luckily, I had established care already with a doctor. So the next morning, I called the doctor's office, said, can I please come in and see anybody, even if it's not my normal doctor? Because I was seeing a high-risk doctor.
Hmm.
So they had me see a midwife. Oh, bleeding can be normal. It is saying that you're pregnant. Like, your periods say you're only 3 weeks, but our things show you don't show up at 3 weeks on our things. So you're further along, and must have just been, weird bleeding and stuff like
Yeah.
that. So we never really knew exactly how far along it was because it was weird when I was tracking. So they took some blood to check my HCG levels. They come back the next day, get more blood. And so they call me after they get the results of the second one. Oh, it's not doubling like it should. It
Hmm.
rose, but it's not doubling like it should. Your numbers are high enough that we should see something on ultrasound when we come in today for an ultrasound. So my parents now live here by me. So I end up calling my parents, hey, will you pick up my daughter, Cora? Will you pick up Cora? I have to go an ultrasound. By the way, I'm pregnant, but, things are going wrong. So we hadn't told anybody. We just have to tell
Yeah.
ourselves. So by the way, so my dad was really nice, picked her up. I went straight to the ultrasound, and I will never forget because I've had quote normal ultrasounds. I know what it's supposed to look like in the
Hmm.
first trimester, and my uterus is empty. So I was like, okay, like that's kind of weird. And the tech was hanging around my ovary on the side a lot. So then she took out the vaginal and did an over the tummy one and took just tons of pictures. And I could tell she was looking at my ovary because I could see that her typing ovary, but
Hmm.
really wasn't saying, anything like that. So I was like, well, obviously it's not not good. There's not a baby in there. Even though they did preface, you're still early, so we might not see anything, but I knew there.
Yeah.
So then I end up seeing the midwife, and she's like, well, it's nothing on there. We don't really know. And so she told me, if you were to bleed a lot more, we think you have an ectopic pregnancy, but I need you to come in first thing in the morning to talk to the actual doctor. Because she's a midwife. She couldn't really say or do anything with something like that. And
Right.
so I was like, oh my gosh, like I have this. So I called my husband, who's on his way home from work. He works far out, so he couldn't come. And this is what basically told him what's happening to Sarah Bond. Like, this is it. We're losing the baby. Like, and it's not even in my uterus. Who even knows it is? I had heard of ectopic pregnancies. I knew what they were, but never in a million years I thought it would happen to me.
Right.
So the next day I go in and see the doctor, and Stacy like, well, you have a pregnancy of unknown location. We don't know where it is, but you're bleeding. And I described it as baby flutters, but I knew it wasn't because I wasn't far enough to really feel that. But it ended up being a bunch of free fluid and blood in my belly because my ovary, I had a large cyst that was bleeding into my belly. So I was feeling and hearing that like swooshing. And so we think you have an ectopic. It's most likely in the tube because that's where they usually are, but we can't see it on ultrasound, so we don't know for sure. So they sent me straight to the hospital to have surgery, and decided to call my parents again. Hey, you need to watch my daughter longer. I have this. So you go straight to the hospital. They get me all prepped up. Like basically, as soon as I was there, 5 minutes later, I was back in my work kind of thing. It was really quick.
Oh my gosh.
So I signed consents of, yes, you can take my tube out, if it needs to happen. And so basically I went under knowing my baby was technically still alive. So I went under knowing that when I woke up, it would be dead. And to me, it felt like I was signing away their death wish. Like that's what it felt like to me. So when I woke up, my tube was gone because it started to burst. It was way too damaged to keep. So he took it out. They drained the large cyst in my ovary. And that was kind of basically it. But I was able to see what the baby looked like because the nurse brought it in one of those kind of containers. I don't really remember exactly what it was, but it was in there and I could see it and I recognized it as like a baby in its late first trimester. So I was a lot further along than I thought. And then I went home and I'm just like, what the heck? What the heck happened to me?
Oh my gosh.
But I was traumatized, but not in the same way as my daughter. Like I was more just sad than anything. We had a lot of support. I had a lot of friends who really supported me and at this point I had already started my blog and all those kind of stuff too. So I had online support. I had online friends and stuff like that who were really helpful. I had people messaging me, oh, don't worry about replying, but I'm thinking of you. I'm so sorry. Things like that. And with my daughter, we kept it to ourselves a lot. We learned that was not helpful. So fairly quickly, we kind of made it public knowledge that this had happened to us. And it was a night and day difference of support. And I felt very supported and that people actually cared about me and what I was going through. And the hardest thing was that my daughter was old enough to really understand because she was 3.5 at this point. And we had already told her we had a baby in my belly. So she was kind of old enough to understand there's a baby in the belly. And I had to say, no, there isn't anymore. And that was a tough conversation, having to explain a concept of death to a 3.5-year-old from someone who's never really lived. It's a very abstract, it's already an abstract thought for adults.
Yeah.
So it's very abstract. So that was one of the hardest things because she would say things every once in a while. That's like, how does a 3.5-year-old say that? And stuff like that. But we somehow made it through. At my 6-week checkup, things look good. You can try again if you want. You can try again right away. Because I had asked, well, why did this happen? And basically, it's just bad luck. Like, I didn't have any of the risk factors. I don't have endometriosis or anything like that. It was just really bad luck, which is the story of my life.
I was just going to say, sounds like a theme, which is so unfortunate.
Yes. So at that point, my husband and I made the conscious decision of we won't prevent, we won't try, because I was terrified to wait whatever amount of time, a year later, find out I'm infertile. So I was
Mm.
afraid that once I decided to try, we would have to try for a year and then I'm infertile. And I really didn't want that large of an age gap between my kids, too. And I was just terrified. I only have one tube left. Of course, it's going to be harder to get pregnant. Even though they told me you have just as much chance as everybody else,
Yeah.
to me, it felt like my chances were cut in half. 2 cycles later, I was pregnant. So I had one full cycle, and then the next cycle is when I got pregnant. So I got pregnant really
Wow.
quick afterwards.
And that resulted in your second child.
Yes, yep, yep. The baby that
Yes.
was just born. Yep.
Yes. And that pregnancy, how was that pregnancy?
It was tough.
Yeah.
I had obviously meticulously tracking my cycles again. So I
Hmm.
knew at 3 weeks, oh, I'm pregnant. 3.5 weeks. And we're like, well, we'll just see. I didn't keep it a secret with my husband. I kind of surprised him a little bit with with the ectopic. This one I didn't. Because he was also home. It was Christmas. Um, and we're like, well, we'll just see we'll just see what happens. I waited a
Yeah.
week or two before I called my doctor for an appointment, just waiting to see if I would bleed, and somehow I didn't. And I started to feel really sick, like, all the nausea and early pregnancy, everything's. And I was just like, I don't know. I just hoped that it wasn't in my tube. And I was like, well, if
Yeah.
it is, I would have felt it by now. Because I didn't see it until 8 weeks. They offered if I wanted to come in earlier for like blood testing. I said no. I'll come in if something happens because I just kind of didn't really want to.
Yeah.
Ignorance is bliss too. And
Yeah.
so I was a little
Yeah.
more scared of not knowing. Like I'll just wait till if something happens. If something happens, I'll call and come in earlier. And luckily nothing did, so I didn't see my doctor till 8 weeks. But I just had to keep telling myself, well, if it was in my other tube, I would have known by now. Or if something was
Hmm.
wrong, I would start bleeding. I was more scared of a miscarriage at this point, of going in and realizing that there was no heartbeat. But we were pretty confident I think we're okay because I was still really sick and I felt very similar to my living daughter. So we took her to the 8 week ultrasound and it was really fun seeing the heartbeat and everything. We were just excited at that point.
Oh,
I
good.
had already been taking baby aspirin as they wanted me to for preeclampsia and everything like that. So it's like, well, this is it, this is it. And it was pretty normal. I was just extremely anxious. I was convinced I was going to lose a baby. And that anxiety really never lettened up until she was born. But come 20 weeks, that anxiety became more of when am I going to get preeclampsia again versus
Mm.
loss. Like I was still always terrified of loss, especially before I could feel her moving around. I was always like, okay, today I'm pregnant and that's okay. Like if something's wrong, I'll know, the doctors will know. Like, I had to consciously like tell myself these things because I was constantly anxious. Like, and I was doing as best as I could. I was exercising, which I like to do, which helps my anxiety. Like I was talking to my husband all the time because he's the only one that really understands everything we've
Yeah.
been through. So even though I was saying the exact same things, I would just talk to get it out. I had some few friends that were really helpful, that I talked to. Like I told a lot of my friends who had preeclampsia that I met online really early on the first time with that topic, but then I also told them again later too, because I just needed that support, people who were there for me and who understood the anxiety. Because my other friends who've had quote normal births, not preeclampsia or pregnant or anything, they just don't understand that anxiety. They just
No.
don't get it. They've never lived it. They don't really realize as much of a possibility it is for them. And so it was really tough. But once I turned 20-ish weeks where preeclampsia kind of does happen, that's when all the anxiety was, oh my gosh, I'm going to get it again. I'm going to get it again. And just holding on that I went in.
Yeah. And you didn't end up getting it this time.
Nope, nope. I didn't even
Yeah.
have any symptoms at all. My blood pressure was totally normal. Like it stayed the exact same way as it was before I was pregnant. Like it never rose or anything like that during my pregnancy. And everything was very normal. I had a scheduled C-section at 39 weeks and 3 days, and I woke up that day and we had a baby that day. Just went to the hospital and just had a baby. It was very, very calm. Leading up to it, I was having lots of cramps that were pretty painful. So at every appointment where they're offered, oh, do you want to check? It's like, yeah, check because I have cramps, but I was
Yeah.
never dilated. But I was having pretty bad cramps, which would be contractions. I just never dilated.
Yeah. So the anxiety was definitely high, but thankfully everything as much as it can, went according to plan this time around.
Hmm. Yeah, it did. I went into a scheduled C-section. It was absolutely wonderful. We were calm in the hospital. My parents came to our house while my daughter was still sleeping, so we had to be there, I think, like at 4:30. We had to be at the hospital
Yeah.
by 4, I think. And so they came over to our house. They were here when my daughter woke up. We just drove over to the hospital. We walked right in. Oh, we're having a baby today. Like, it was so, I was anxiety. I still had anxiety, right? It's surgery. I was so nervous because, all my trauma basically stemmed from my previous C-section. So I was still
Yeah.
nervous. So at every appointment leading up to my doctor, will you please explain to me what normal one feels like, what will happen, and stuff like that. And so they did everything. I hung out in the L&D room until my time at 7 a.m. that morning, and everything was just calm. The anesthesiologist came in. Oh, how was your last one? So he kind of gave me more anesthesia, and he offered me that there was something, I can't even think of the name of it, but they could give it to me after surgery while I was still numb with the spinal block. That would kind of keep me still numb. He said you
Mm.
just kind of feel like just cramps versus
Mm-hmm.
like everything. And so I consented to that too. So it's like, yeah, I don't want to feel any of it.
Yes,
And it was
please.
absolutely wonderful. I was in basically no pain. Like, I was sore, obviously, but I never really felt much of pain. Um, and my husband went right to the OR with me when they gave me the spinal. My husband was right there. He was holding my hand. They didn't make him get out, which I know happens a lot, that they don't let the spouse in until
Yeah.
afterwards. But he was right there with me. So whether that's what the hospital does or they're doing that because I was so anxious, I don't know.
Yeah.
I was really glad with that. So he was right there with me. They gave me the spinal. They laid me down. They didn't even strap down my arms, which is what happened the last time. And everything was just calm. I felt my pregnant belly one last time, and then they put the curtain up and scrubbed me clean. And the anesthesiologist was really great and nice. And when I would feel nauseous, would give me something. And like the smells, they pinned like some essential oil on my
Oh,
hospital gown,
wow.
so I smelled that instead of all the OR smells.
Yeah.
And it
That's
was
so
absolutely
nice.
wonderful. A few minutes later, they pop her up around the curtain, and I saw her, and I started crying because wow, it's actually here. But she struggled with the transition, which I'm glad they told me that before. The scheduled C-sections, those babies sometimes have a hard time with
Yes.
the transition. So I'm glad they told me that before because I would have freaked. But so she struggled with that. She had a lot of the amniotic fluid in her lungs, so she took a little bit to kind of get going. Like, she was still breathing and stuff. She just had a lot of junk in her lungs. So my husband went with her while they did all of that to her and everything like that. So then they sewed me up. Things were fine. They were all just kind of talking. We were just, it was just so awesome. It was so
So
wonderful.
different. So
Yeah,
different than the
very
first time
different.
around.
Yeah, it was
Yeah.
interesting afterwards. After I'm all sewed up and everything, my doctor comes around the curtain like, "Oh, I'm so glad. Congratulations. I'll talk to you in a little bit, but just so you know, your uterus is really thin." I had already asked him to take my other tube out, so
Yeah.
I'm no tubes now because I'm like, I'm done. I'm not gonna have one anymore. So he took out my other tube, and it's like, "Oh, by the way, your uterus is really thin, so it's a good thing you took your tube out."
Yeah.
It's like, well, I'm glad I already decided I was done before that happened. So then they wheeled me back into the room I was going to be in. The nurse is monitoring me for that hour post-op. My husband comes walking in with her and
Oh,
places her right on my chest. And I had that for the first time. I had that, golden hour skin to skin. And I just couldn't believe it. And I actually understood the initial bonding and the initial love for the first time because it was immediate with her, and it was just awesome. Like, now I understand why people think birth is so wonderful at
yeah.
times, because it really was this kind of time. It was awesome.
I'm so glad that you were able to have that experience. So you had talked about in between your kiddos is when you started your blog.
Hmm.
Were you also on Instagram at that time, or did Instagram come a little bit later?
It came with it. I started at the same time. I've always loved to write. I always have. So it's kind of like an outlet of doing this, and then it was an outlet to share my story too. So I don't
Yeah.
know if they're still up there on my blog. My first couple posts were just really like generic mom stuff. I don't even know if they're still public, but that's kind of what it started off. And then I found out May was Preeclampsia Awareness Month, which is the month my daughter was born in too. So
Mm.
that's when I kind of shared my story and shared it on Instagram, and then just kind of grew from that. Like it seems very, I know everyone says that, oh, it just grew from that, but it really did. 'Cause that's kind of where I found what I wanted to write and talk about. And that's kind of where I found my audience, I guess, of other people who connected. And it really helped me heal to find people that went through exactly what I did because no one in my real life ever did. So I
Mm-hmm.
found other people who had preeclampsia, who had it at the same time as me, or had it other times, and whose babies were in the NICU too. So it's nice to find people that were like me. So that's kind of when I started. I mostly do Instagram now because that's kind of what I like to do.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I still write blog posts and I still do that, but it takes a lot more time than an Instagram caption.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, and like you said, you've formed this community, and your community is um it's diverse, but it's also very specific to preeclampsia survivors and NICU survivors. It's amazing what social media can do. Social media can be very hurtful to a lot of new moms who are going through things like this and just desperately trying to find someone to relate to. But then it's also such an opportunity to connect with someone like you, um, and not feel alone, which is
Mhm.
our mission as well at Quiet Connection. And why I love your content. I end up sharing a lot of what you post in my stories a lot of the
Well,
time.
thanks.
Because you do what you are doing is great in terms of relatability and solidarity for sure. And I know if it's resonating with me, it's going to resonate with my listeners as well. So, um I love what you're doing. I will admit I haven't checked out the blog, but I will do. But I guess to kind of bring it full circle, again, so many questions I still have. So, uh we'll have to do a follow-up or something someday. I don't know. But
Sure.
to
Yeah, no problem. I
to
could talk for a while.
I know, but to sort of bring it full circle, I usually choose one of two questions, but I think I'm going to ask both. Um, First, what do you hope my listeners take away from your story?
I hope they take away that it's okay that if your birth was traumatic, like there's nothing wrong with you if you felt that way. And it's okay to feel that way, but there is hope that eventually you will feel okay. It may not be tomorrow, it may not be next year, but eventually you will. You'll be able
Mm-hmm.
to kind of come to terms with it and the fact of it won't consume you. It will always be a part of you, but eventually it won't consume you. But also for the fact that like it is possible to have such a great birth afterwards if you choose to have more kids. Because a lot of people in this community choose to end at one, which is fine. That's, it's great. One and done is just great too. Or a lot of people do choose to have more, but end up having kind of a repeat or less
Mm-hmm.
severe than what they had. I feel like not a lot end up having a birth where there was no complications really. So it is possible because that was kind of scary for me. Is like everyone I know in the community never had a great birth, afterwards really.
Yeah.
And so it's possible, which I'm glad it's possible.
Yeah. And then my always ending question is, if you could go back in time, way before your kiddos, way before you were even considering having kiddos, and you can't tell yourself anything about what's going to come or what you're going to go through, but you can instill something in yourself. It can be a word, it can be a phrase, it can be a feeling to sort of prepare you and help you get through that time. What would you instill in yourself?
Um, Probably empathy. That's the one that kind of comes up. Just because before I experienced all I have, I really didn't have much empathy when it came to like child loss or miscarriage or anything like that, just because I didn't understand it. Like I couldn't understand why it would hurt so bad.
Mm-hmm.
So probably that and the idea of comforting people when they're in grief made me really, really uncomfortable. Now it
Mm.
doesn't because I understand how much it means, but it really did before everything happened.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I love, my favorite part about that question is I don't think I've ever gotten the same answer twice. And I love that. I love that empathy. It is unfortunate the circumstances that sort of made you want to instill that within yourself. But empathy is such a deep and connecting thing. And we are Quiet Connection after all. So connection is kind of our thing. So I think that's beautiful. But yeah, I want to thank you again for agreeing to share your story with us. And I highly encourage my listeners, if you are not already following Knock on Motherhood, to do so, because Courtney, your content is awesome.
Thank you.
I strive to be as creative as you and some of the other accounts that I'm following. So check it out, especially if you have gone through some of the things that Courtney has gone through, or if any of her story resonates with you. And yeah, I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Of course. Courtney, thanks again for sharing your story and for your ongoing dedication to raising awareness and providing support to the NICU and preeclampsia community. You can keep up with us on Quiet Connection by following us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, and Threads at Quiet Connection or at Quiet Connection Podcast. You can help our community grow by reviewing and sharing our podcast on social media. And you could also consider becoming a Patreon member and gain access to things like bonus content and ad-free listening. To share your personal journey, you can contact us through our website at quietconnectionpodcast.com or by email at quietconnectionppmh@gmail.com. Join us next time when another story is told and you realize you are not alone. I see you.